Talk of conspiracy theories is unusually vexatious. Now, why unusually? Well, because if you happen to be literate, then you know conspiracies occur. From automobile manufacturers covering up engineering malfeasance, the Ford Pinto scandal, and the VW emissions scandal, skullduggery in the world of international finance, the Panama Papers comes to mind, to political intrigues like the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Watergate affair. You will also be doubtless aware that theories about those conspiracies were initially ridiculed, and that is because there is a stigma against conspiracy theories in popular discourse. Now, what should we make of this stigma? Conspiracy theories are, to name a few objections, taken to be the product of a crippled epistemology, gullible thinking, something akin to paranoid ideation, the result of basic errors in probabilistic reasoning, or when believed, result in serious negative social consequences. Now, these views are largely propounded by those who claim that conspiracy theories generally can be assessed before the merits of individual conspiracy theories. These are what we call generalist positions, which view conspiracy theories as typically irrational. The generalist thinks we have a general case for skepticism about conspiracy theories, which in turn justifies the pejorative aspect of the label conspiracy theory. Yet the generalist faces significant issues if we take their epistemic utterances seriously. For example, as David Cody has argued, generalists often rely upon a naive understanding of the appeal to authority and the role officialness plays in the rivals to conspiracy theories. Lee Basham argues generalists fail to principally accommodate both the conspiracy theories they take to be irrational and those theories which cite conspiracies as salient causes that they endorse as being warranted. Basham has also argued that generalism about conspiracy theories has produced a curious reticence to talk about real conspiracies by the very people we should expect to expose them. And according to Charles Pigden, the fact that journalists, etc., typically treat claims of conspiracy with disdain has had the unfortunate consequence of making it all the easier for conspirators to get away with their work, the consequence of which can literally be getting away with murder. I have argued that generalists tend to associate conspiracy theorizing with what is likely non-typical conspiracy theorists, and that generalists critically underestimate the prior probability of conspiratorial thinking being in the pool of candidate explanations of political phenomena. We philosophers are particularists, and we argue that you cannot principally assess conspiracy theories as a class, but rather the analysis must be on a case-by-case basis. Particularists worry that we tend to express concerns about conspiracy theories generally before beginning to even analyse them. The prima facie suspicion of conspiracy theories generally, before assessing the particulars of individual theories, gets things back to front. Conspiracy theories, like any theory, should be assessed on their evidential merits. Yet one particularly vexatious feature of talk of conspiracy theories comes out of a commonly expressed worry that we are suspicious of them because of the evidence often cited in their favour. Conspiracy theories may well sometimes be warranted, such an argument would have it, but typically the standards and kinds of evidence used in support of such theories is problematic, even lax. Yet, as we will see, it is not obvious that conspiracy theorists have lax evidential standards. Many of the suspicious kinds of evidence conspiracy theorists appeal to are not all that weird when properly considered, and many of the evidential issues we hold against said theorists are not taken to be problems when associated with non-conspiracy theories. Indeed, as we will see, the evidence associated with conspiracy theories is regularly cited with respect to other kinds of explanations. As such, if there is an issue with the evidence, it is an issue of principle. The evidence is being abused or not used appropriately. That is to say, once we look at the principles which ground the conspiracy theorist's use and skepticism of certain kinds of evidence, we will see the same principles either being used elsewhere in a non-problematic way, or the principles espoused by the conspiracy theorists turn out to be justified. Let us start then by looking at a common complaint about conspiracy theories: evidence manipulation. When assessing the strength of any argument put forward by someone else, particularly in a topic we might not be well informed about, there is always the worry that maybe we have not been told everything that we need to know. People tinker and play with evidence all the time. I might tell you that the reason I voted for a certain political candidate was my belief they were the best person for the job, leaving out any mention of the substantial bribe they offered me. My story cites some evidence, it is in fact true I think the candidate is the best, but leaves out some other piece of salient evidence, the bribe. This then is what we might call selectiveness. Selectiveness is an activity associated with the presentation of evidence and explanations, and is a feature of any explanation. If there is a problem with the selective use of evidence in conspiracy theories in particular, then either conspiracy theorists are somehow overly prone to being selective in their use of evidence, or the kind of selective use of evidence we see in conspiracy theories is of a problematic kind. Take, for example, the various 9/11 inside job hypotheses. These theories collectively claim that the events of September 11th were orchestrated by elements of the US government, and these theories are typically labelled pejoratively as conspiracy theories. Advocates of the inside job hypotheses are often characterised as being selective in their use of evidence. Said evidence is said to be selective in that it is comprised of the selected parts of the total evidence, and by only citing a subset of that evidence, they falsely conclude that the evidence strongly suggests that the events were orchestrated by elements within the US. There are then two kinds of alleged selectiveness in play here. The first is the selecting of snippets of the total evidence. The second follows from the first, the framing of the subset of evidence as strongly suggesting a particular conclusion. As previously noted, the first point is true of any explanation, and so the worry must centre on the second issue. Has the subset of the evidence been manipulated to suggest a conclusion that might not follow should we have access to the total evidence? That is, are conspiracy theorists more likely to manipulate the evidence in this way? Now that is an empirical question, but what we can say with some certainty is that if we are worried about conspiracy theorists manipulating evidence, we should be worried about non-conspiracy theorists doing exactly the same thing. Historians, for example, selectively cite evidence from the historical record, but they do this because A, citing all the available evidence would clutter their narrative, and B, only some of the available evidence is salient. It is the second point which underscores the idea that selectivity of evidence can be principled. For the Marxist historian, the principle is something about the role of historical materialism in history. For the advocate of the great men of history thesis, the principle is something about individuals rising above the masses. The list could go on. Scientists select which pieces of evidence they take as salient when engaging in research, ruling out data points which are unrelated to the phenomena being explored. Social psychologists select which p-values are salient to their models, and so on. In each of these cases, there is a principle involved which explains why the evidence has been selected, and why such selective citation of evidence is not a prima facie problem. We might be able to find reasons to call the principle into question, but the fact that selectiveness is principled goes a long way to showing that its adherents are not acting irrationally. If you want to challenge the selection of the evidence, the right way to do it is to challenge the principle behind such selection. Is then the principle of selection by the conspiracy theorists ill-defined? It is not obviously at fault. A cursory glance at recent history presents us with a plethora of actual conspiratorial activity on the part of governments and corporations. As I've argued elsewhere, how we rule these examples either in or out as instances of actual conspiratorial activity affects our judgment as to how likely conspiracies are now. If we assume conspiratorial activity is rare in our societies, The principle behind the conspiracy theorist's selective citation of evidence would at first glance appear unmotivated. But even in a society which was relatively unconspired, there is still a burden of proof issue. After all, the selection and misrepresentation, witting or unwittingly, of evidence by members of influential institutions is a contravention of the duty of care said institutions have towards the public. So even if you think the principle is problematic because conspiracies are rare, then the principle might still be warranted because claims of conspiracy are extraordinary in the sense we really ought to investigate particular conspiracy theories in order to quash suspicions about specific conspiracies. Now, what seems to motivate our worry about the conspiracy theorist's use of selective evidence is our belief that conspiracies are rare. That is to say, we judge the evidence of such theories with the principle that evidence for such theories must be hard to come by, and thus the compelling evidence for some conspiracy theory must have somehow been manipulated. Now, we might be tempted to think there is a sufficient check against selectiveness if we can go and inspect the evidence for ourselves. After all, if the evidence is part of the public record, then people in positions of authority will be less likely to be selective in their presentation of evidence. They could, and most of us hope would, be found out. However, this is only going to be a check against selectiveness if the consequences of being found out has repercussions. If we live in a society where such behaviour is hushed up, or even ignored, then public scrutiny might just lead to an increasing mistrust of certain kinds of authorities, thus raising fears about the likelihood of conspiracies occurring elsewhere, here and now. Indeed, sometimes evidence is selectively moved from the pool of evidence. The CIA really did delete a 6,700 page, and that's correct, it was 6,700 pages, not words, not paragraphs, pages, report on their enhanced interrogation program. And whilst they claim the deletion of this presumably damning report was a mere clerical error, the worry remains that as only one digital copy seemed to exist, and it was deleted before anyone outside the CIA could read it, this suggests the CIA selectively removed evidence which would have shone a worrying light on the epistemic and moral failures of their enhanced interrogation, aka torture program. These concerns cannot be easily pushed to one side. So whilst we can charge conspiracy theorists of sometimes selectively citing evidence in favour of their theories, we cannot claim this is a vice peculiar to them. Selective citation of evidence is an activity found throughout our epistemic communities, and the conspiracy theorist's selective citation of evidence can be as principled as anyone else's. Now, another way to look at how evidence might be used or abused by conspiracy theorists is by looking at what Brian L. Keeley calls errant data, information which is not part of the pool of evidence for some explanatory hypothesis, but can be construed as evidence for some rival hypothesis. Keeley distinguishes two kinds of errant data: unaccounted for data and contradictory data. Keeley argues that the existence of errant data is not a special problem for conspiracy theories per se, since given the imperfect nature of our human understanding of the world, we should expect that even the best possible theory would not explain all the available data. Some data in the general pool of evidence will always be errant to some particular explanation. This is the principle of explanatory fuzziness. Explanations are, at least with respect to topics like history and the social sciences, typically fuzzy around the edges. So while conspiracy theories sometimes cite data explained by or contrary to some rival theory, most rival theories cite errant data as well. Take, for example, the official explanation of the events of 9/11. Part of the evidence for the theory Al-Qaeda was responsible is a videotaped message by Osama bin Laden claiming to be behind the attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. Some of the inside job theories about 9/11 ignore or selectively fail to take into account this evidence because it conflicts with those conspiracy theories. As such, the citation of errant data is no mark of the incredible. We cannot dismiss a conspiracy theory solely because of the citation of data which supports one hypothesis, but is unaccounted for by some rival. However, the existence of contradictory data presents a different and possibly more interesting concern. A frequently discussed example of such errant contradictory data by both conspiracy theorists and non-conspiracy theorists is disinformation. The activity of introducing fabricated information into the pool of evidence in order to make some explanation look warranted when it otherwise might not be should be a concern to us all. Indeed, the worry about disinformation is no idle fancy by conspiracy theorists. The dodgy dossier, which allegedly justified the invasion of Iraq, really was doctored by political operators in the UK. And the USSR invented the term disinformation, from the Russian disinformatia, in the late 1930s to portray the conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry into the charges made against Leon Trotsky in the Moscow trials, aka the Dewey Commission, that the Moscow trials were in fact show trials, as unwarranted. Now, you do not need to be worried about the existence of contemporary or historical conspiracies to be worried about disinformation. People, after all, disinform others all the time, and yet we only seem to think this is extraordinary when a conspiracy theorist talks about it. We should ask why that is. Now, Susan Feldman presents an interesting gloss on disinformation, the analysis of which informs our response to claims about contradictory data being apparently abused by conspiracy theorists. Looking at what she calls counterfact theories, a kind of conspiracy theory which gets its epistemic weight from errant contradictory data, Feldman argues counterfact theories are prima facie irrational. Why? Because explanations which rely on errant contradictory data are unfalsifiable and thus irrational to believe by default. This point has been made before and in stricter epistemic terms by Brian L. Keeley. However, Keeley argues that if disinformation is being put out by conspirators, then conspiracy theories would be unfalsifiable, and this is not a problem per se for such theories. If there really is a conspiracy in existence, then it is not unreasonable to assume disinformation might be being produced to cover it up. Not just that, but as I have argued elsewhere, the production of disinformation is merely an auxiliary hypothesis for some conspiracy theories. It is not a feature of all of them, and as such, the strength of that auxiliary hypothesis must be assessed on its own evidence. So it is not the case that conspiracy theories which suggest the production of disinformation are automatically irrational to believe, as Feldman suggests. The auxiliary hypothesis about the disinformation needs to be assessed with respect to the evidence that supports it, and then its evidential weight with respect to the conspiracy theory itself needs to be calculated. Indeed, this tells us something quite interesting about disinformation. Even if we can show that disinformation is not being produced, this does not necessarily show that the related conspiracy theory is unwarranted. Claims of disinformation are claims about how the conspirators are engaging in a particular kind of activity designed to keep their conspiracy secret. Falsifying such a claim does not mean that there is no conspiracy, but rather that this particular kind of evidence for the existence of the conspiracy does not apply. This leads to an interesting worry. If you think that the government has used disinformation in the past, then it is not unreasonable to suspect they might be producing it now. Our knowledge of the past instances of disinformation gives us reason to at least suspect it is still a facet of political discourse now. The same is true when we consider the past use of selective evidence and the like. Now, our notion of the independent likelihood, or the prior probability, of any kind of conspiratorial activity happening here and now depends on our beliefs about the kind of society in which we live. If you grew up in a culture where deceit and cover-ups are commonplace, then you'll be much more inclined to believe cover-ups are not just happening now, but you will find claims about them elsewhere more plausible than the person who thinks they live in a largely open society. As Alfred Moore has argued, older democracies are the product of people creating institutions to monitor the things they distrust about their governments. As such, these evidential concerns are what warranted the institutions we have today, and it is not obvious that the creation of these institutions have completely absolved us of those worries. Beliefs such as these do not tell us that any particular and contemporary conspiracy theory is warranted. However, they do inform our judgments about how likely we think particular kinds of deceptive activities are, which in turn affects our judgments about claims of disinformation, selectiveness, and the like. That is to say, they are claims about the prior instance of conspiratorial activity, which in turn changes our notion of just how probable such activity is now. The principle at stake here, then, is if we are going to dismiss claims of disinformation and the like, then we need some argument to the extent that we have good reason to think arguments about the past incidence of such activity tells us little about the here and now. The history of past conspiratorial activity cannot be easily swept away, especially when new evidence of conspiring seems to be constantly coming to light. Take, for example, false flags. A false flag is an operation run by members of one political establishment designed to make it look as if it were the action of some other. The flag of the culprits is merely a ruse. The most noted and admittedly only alleged false flag operation was the Reichstag fire of 1933. When the Reichstag building in Berlin was burnt down, the Communist Party of Germany was implicated. The then Chancellor of Germany, Adolf Hitler, urged the President of the Weimar Republic, Paul von Hindenburg, to enable emergency legislation suspending civil liberties so that the suspected arsonist could be rounded up. This had the effect of the National Socialist Party becoming the biggest party in the German parliament, and this curious and convenient fact has led some conspiracy theorists, which includes some historians to this day, to argue that the fire was started by members of the National Socialist Party in order to incriminate the communists. That is to say, the act of arson was a false flag event designed to bolster the power of the Nazis in the German parliament. Now, what is interesting about false flags is that they are inherently conspiratorial, in a way that disinformation is not. A false flag is a case where one party covers up their actions by falsely claiming they were the result of some other party. Disinformation, however, could be the product of one person setting out to mislead another. As such, false flags are a kind of evidence that we might think is unique to claims of conspiracy, unlike those about disinformation. Now, people were suspicious about the Reichstag fire of 1933 because it was awfully convenient for the National Socialist Party. That is to say, it was very lucky the Reichstag building burnt down, and that luck seems suspicious when we consider what happened next. As such, this might be an example of what Joel Boulding and Jason Taylor call fortuitous data, a kind of evidence which is lucky in such a way that it suggests it has been fabricated. For example, the official theory about the attack on the Pentagon on September 11, 2001 makes reference to a piece of what might be considered fortuitous data. American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the only reinforced section of the Pentagon. For some conspiracy theorists, the fortuitous nature of this event requires an explanation, given just how convenient it was that Flight 77 hit the only part of the Pentagon designed to withstand such an impact. Yet data which is lucky need not necessarily be fortuitous. It might just be fortunate. Fortunate data is information which supports some story, is lucky, and the lucky nature of the data is unexplained by the theory. Fortunate data is merely lucky. As such, the problem with fortuitous data is that it is a subset of the larger set of fortunate data. Fortunate data is simply data that is lucky, and said luckiness is left unexplained by the official story. Fortuitous data, on the other hand, has the added property of being too lucky to be true. As such, anyone can respond to the claim, "Wasn't it lucky that Flight 77 hit that part of the Pentagon?" by saying it was lucky, but said luck does not need to be addressed by the theory at hand. Now, a potential response here is that what demarcates the fortunate from the fortuitous is some claim about the luckiness of certain kinds of evidence. That is to say, we might rely somewhat on past instances and what an appraisal of those instances tell us. So we might take it that the police are, all things considered, trustworthy when it comes to presenting evidence of criminal wrongdoing here and now. However, if we were to look at a case from the context of the 1970s, when the fitting up of suspects was more commonplace, our suspicions about how corrupt the police were then would have affected our suspicion about just how fortunate or fortuitous some data was with respect to a particular case. This indicates that if we are going to distinguish between fortunate and fortuitous data, between data that is lucky and so lucky it's not true, then we either need to focus on the centrality of said data to the proposed explanation, or look for patterns of fortunate data which suggest the data is suspiciously fortunate. The problem then is that we cannot principally distinguish between data which is fortuitous and data which is merely fortunate, without having already made some claim about the likeliness of the alleged conspiracy in question. As such, just because some data which supports a conspiracy theory is lucky, that tells us nothing about whether the conspiracy theory is unlikely, let alone false. Now, not all evidence for or against conspiracy theories is manipulated. Sometimes it is cited as existing without it being able to be examined. That is, some of the evidence is secret. Claims about what we might call secret evidence, some piece of purported evidence where the justification for the belief that the information presented is true is suppressed, are often used to both counter various conspiracy theories and also to bolster them. For example, Donald Rumsfeld, among many other members of both the US and the UK governments, argued that the pejoratively labelled conspiracy theories about the real reason for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 were unreasonable. Why? Because the public should trust the evidence provided by the CIA and MI6 in secret. Now, if such evidence is not supported with other non-secret evidence, then we should remain agnostic about its evidential weight. If the debunking of any claim, conspiracy theory or otherwise, relies upon secret evidence, then it is reasonable to treat it with suspicion. Even in cases where the person citing such evidence appears credible and trustworthy, there is always the possibility that they are being insincere, mistaken, or have even been misled. Of course, we might want to admit in some cases of secret evidence. There will be instances where it is appropriate, say, to hide the source of some evidence to protect the source themselves. Information about governmental malfeasance might only come to light where the source is assured of anonymity. In other cases, we might be concerned about portions of the total evidence not being salient to the issue at hand, so we reserve the right to keep some of the evidence private or secret. However, in each of these cases, a principle can be given as to why secrecy is necessary, which should reassure people as to why some of the evidence is being kept secret. In such cases, we should also be able to point towards evidence which is not secret, which warrants the claim in question. However, all this does is push the issue back one step, because the principle espoused as to why some evidence is being kept secret could also be insincere, and taken to be an example of evidence manipulation. As such, the unexpressed nature of the justification for secret evidence, even in the case of trusting the speaker implicitly, is at best hesitant grounds for accepting the claim. Given that secret evidence is found both in conspiracy theories and their rivals, and arguably is used more potently by the advocates of what are sometimes called official theories, we cannot principally distinguish warranted versus unwarranted conspiracy theories merely with respect to evidence secrecy. Now, the previous issues were all about kinds of evidence. However, there are worries about the way in which we talk about evidence generally, which also needs to be taken into account and analysed, some of which suggest that our attitude towards evidence generally about conspiracy theories is problematic. Sometimes it is claimed that certain conspiracy theories invoke conspiracies which are so vast, either with respect to time existed or people involved, that evidence for the conspiracy should be readily available now. As such, the lack of clear evidence in favour of the conspiracy is taken to be evidence against it. We might think of this as some claim like, it's too big to be true. Take, for example, the work of Michael Barkun, whose typology of conspiracies is often cited as a reason for skepticism of big, all-embracing conspiracy theories. Barkun speciates out claims of conspiracy into three types: event, systemic, and super conspiracies. Belief in an event conspiracy can be rational, because they concern a limited, discrete event or set of events, where the conspiratorial forces are alleged to have focused their energies on a limited, well-defined objective. However, systemic and super conspiracies, which refer to large-scale, institutional claims of conspiratorial activity, are typically irrational, at least according to Barkun. Systemic conspiracies refer to plots where the conspirators have a broad goal, such as taking control of a nation-state or subverting existing institutions. Super conspiracies combine both event and systemic conspiracies, citing ever larger conspiracies, and casting into doubt any evidence for the conspiracy, since the conspirators are now considered to be in the position to control and subvert the evidential record. Now, leaving to one side the already examined claim that such theories are inherently unfalsifiable, a point which Barkun presses, arguing that the size of a conspiracy makes belief in an associated conspiracy theory prima facie irrational is an interesting move, in part because it ultimately rests upon a self-defeating principle. The bigger the conspiracy, the more likely such conspiracy theorists believe evidence of the conspiracy will leak. As such, the absence of evidence is taken to be evidence of absence. That is despite the fact that, as we have seen, there are reasons to think that conspiracy theorists are not wrong, to think that conspirators can manipulate evidence against conspiracy theories. This has not stopped conspiracy theory theorists from continuing to argue that big conspiracy theories are unlikely. David Robert Grimes, in On the Viability of Conspiratorial Beliefs, presents a mathematical model for why conspiracies of a certain size are prone to fail. To establish a best-case scenario for the viability of a conspiracy, Grimes deliberately overestimates the number of conspirators involved in it. This is because the most generous estimate of the viability of any conspiratorial activity about some institution will come out of assuming that everyone in the institution was in on the conspiracy. However, when he applies his model to contemporary conspiracy theories, such as the faking of the moon landing and the like, Grimes seemingly forgets why he overestimated in the first place. As such, he assumes that for us to take the moon landing conspiracy theory seriously, everyone at NASA in the 1960s must have known the moon landing was faked. This, I think, points towards a fundamental problem with the kind of arguments which state it's too big to be true. We need to distinguish between claims of the size of the conspiracy versus the organizational structure of the putative conspiracy. A conspiracy can look big, and yet only a small number of people involved in it might know its full extent or aim. Some members of the conspiracy will be lackeys, goons, or even unwitting conspirators. It is even possible to be involved in a conspiracy without realizing you're conspiring. As such, size only matters once you take into account structure, and once you take that into account, we encounter the problem of information hierarchies. Lee Basham, in multiple works, has introduced the notion of toxicity, or the toxic truth, which is evidence of a conspiracy that no one will touch or disseminate because of feared negative social consequences. Take, for example, the following hypothetical. Imagine there is newly discovered evidence by an investigative journalist concerning the events of 9/11. This new evidence strongly suggests the received narrative is not just wrong, but that members of the press and the government have been seeking to keep this evidence secret. The journalist approaches her editor about the story and is told to shelve it. The consequences of going to print would be disastrous, she is told, not just for the paper, which will be implicated as being part of the cover-up, but also for the government. After all, if it really could be shown that the last 15 years of public discourse surrounding the events of 9/11 was based on a sustained lie, then the loss of trust in the government could lead to massive civil unrest and so forth. The truth of what she's discovered would be toxic, and thus for the good of the nation state, it must remain suppressed. Toxicity then presents a problem. We cannot necessarily appeal to authority to decide whether the evidence is good, because said authority might be interested in downplaying the evidence. However, an appeal to the evidence itself would be just as troubling, because if it really is toxic, then we should expect this information about the centrality or salience of said evidence. Not just that, there will be arguments to the extent that the evidence is the result of selective tampering in the pool of evidence, or other evidence will be used selectively to show up said toxic truth. Sorting out the evidence from the non-evidence in such a case will be no trivial task. Now, one reply, albeit one that could be seen as complementary to Basham's notion of toxicity, is to take the sting out of the idea these truths are toxic, and simply say that the non-reporting of such evidence is merely polite. By polite here, we mean something like, it is just not talked about. Some seemingly toxic truths might just be the polite fictions we employ to ensure the smooth running of our society. Yes, the citizen of the 1970s might say, we know the police regularly plant evidence in order to secure convictions, but those criminals are obviously guilty of something. Otherwise, why would the police arrest them in the first place? The idea here is not that these truths are too toxic to reveal to the citizenry, but rather some of these truths are the kind of things the public knows about and chooses to ignore. The journalist who tries to draw attention to them, for example, is not acting bravely, but rather foolishly. No one wants to know about it. Of course, both analyses can be true. Some evidence might be politely ignored by the populace, and some of it might be so toxic as to require an active cover-up. Perhaps more salient to our discussion is the idea that politeness could be used to justify not revealing some evidence which turns out to be toxic. After all, what better way to tell some journalists, don't bother reporting that, no one cares about it? Claiming some terrible crime will be politely ignored is just another way to cover it up. Whatever the case, the principle behind both toxicity and politeness seems secure. There are certain truths about society which might be considered unspeakable, whether that be an edict from on high or just by popularity. We cannot expect that evidence of a conspiracy or indeed any kind of wrongdoing will be automatically the subject of popular opprobrium. Indeed, given the continuing tendency to downplay the seriousness of, say, sexual assault, and the unwillingness by governments to acknowledge, let alone address, shocking inequalities in our societies now, shows that a certain amount of politeness or aversion to toxicity is still a factor in society today, and we do not need to talk about conspiracies or conspiracy theories to justify that. So, one response to all of this is to say, surely issues to do with the evidence are usually attended to by subject experts. If I want to know whether some claim about particle physics is something I should believe, I am best off talking with a particle physicist rather than an accountant. If I want to know whether it is plausible to believe that Hitler was a heroin user, I am best off talking with a historian of the Third Reich than I am an archaeologist. However, the worry about how we pass evidence for conspiracy theories muddies the waters for two reasons. One, who are the experts? And two, are the experts conspiring? The first issue seems like it should be the easiest to address. After all, conspiracy theories cite evidence, and we often know who the appropriate authorities are when it comes to assessing that evidence. However, some portion of the evidence for a particular conspiracy will be of a conspiratorial nature, such as claims about past conspiratorial activity, and some of the experts on either side will not be experts at all. Strange as it may seem, but we are often insensitive to the distinction between someone being in a position of authority and someone being an expert. Some theories have a kind of official status, but just because it has that status, this does not tell us it is supported by any evidence. Rather, it just means it has been endorsed by some influential institution. Because institutions are many and varied, their official status can be conferred on theories in a variety of different ways, some epistemic, some merely political or pragmatic. Now, if a relevant authority has endorsed a theory, then we should probably prefer it to a rival theory with no such endorsement. That is, if we are in no position to inspect the evidence ourselves. However, just saying that a theory has been endorsed tells us little about what the experts believe. Relevant expertise here is important when it comes to assessing whether an endorsement weighs upon the applicability of the evidence. Which brings us to a big question. Is there a community of experts when it comes to assessing conspiracy theories, like there is when it comes to the analysis of theories, say, in the sciences? After all, something unusual happens when we front theory with conspiracy. Take, for example, scientific theories. New scientific theories are generated constantly, and most of them do not bear fruit when tested. We all accept that the process of assessing scientific theories is one of working out when they are warranted, and when they are interesting, but ultimately fruitless speculations. Yet we do not think of scientific theories as inherently or prima facie unwarranted just because most such theories will turn out to be bad. One explanation for this is to say that there is a salient difference between theorizing in the sciences and theorizing about conspiracies. When we theorize in the sciences, we are engaging in a process attached to, although not necessarily occurring in, certain institutions. As such, this points to the improvised nature of conspiracy theories, and to the improvised element of the epistemology which analyzes such theories. Improvised here should not be taken as a marker of false or pseudo-knowledge. Rather, it is the recognition that we are dealing with a kind of knowledge which is in some sense cobbled together and lacks institutional or accredited features. We know what counts as scientific evidence and what are considered to be scientific theories because they come out of the work of scientists and scientific institutions. Yet there are no such experts or institutions when it comes to conspiracy theories. Now, other kinds of improvised knowledge include things such as gossip, a form of malicious testimony, and rumour, a way in which certain propositions can be tested for their truth value by asking, "Have you heard?" Like conspiracy theories, there are no experts in gossiping or rumour mongering, in the sense that we do think there are experts in doing physics, chemistry, or biology. Rather, the kinds of people we think of having epistemic weight when it comes to assessing conspiracy theories are investigative reporters, officials, and the like. But there are no recognised experts in the accredited sense of expert when it comes to individual conspiracy theories. There might, however, be expertise in the field of conspiracy theories, to wit there might be expertise about both conspiracy theorists and what constitutes a conspiracy theory. However, when it comes to particular conspiracy theories, our knowledge is of an improvised nature. Take, for example, the various 9/11 inside job hypotheses, which claim the Twin Towers and Building 7 of the World Trade Center were controlled demolitions, rather than the results or impacts of flights AA-11 and AA-175. Some of the evidence for these claims is in the domain of physics, such as claims about the way in which the towers fell. Some of the evidence is somewhere in the domain of the political sciences, sociology, and psychology, such as claims about the intentions of the actors involved, and the like. Whilst you can go to experts about some of the cited evidence, there is no one institutional or accredited group you can appeal to appraise the theory as a whole. Now, none of this gives us reason to have a prima facie suspicion of these things called conspiracy theories. After all, despite the fact we recognise scientific evidence and theories, This does not tell us that any given theory is true or warranted. As such, the improvised nature of conspiracy theories as a kind of knowledge is not in itself reason to suspect conspiracy theories as knowledge. It is simply an interesting feature of this discourse. This suggests there could be conspiracy theory experts. But note a problem with this story is potentially the institutional nature of accrediting expertise. Certain conspiracy theorists are, rightly or wrongly, worried that hierarchical institutions, such as those involved in accrediting or endorsing theories, and experts, are involved in conspiracies to cover up or downplay the evidence cited by conspiracy theorists. In this sense, conspiracy theorists might want to embrace the improvised nature of analysing conspiracy theories, rather than face the fact that there might be conspiracies in the institutions they want to embrace as endorsing the theories they take it are warranted. My contention in this paper is that the kind of evidence that we've seen used in support of conspiracy theories are examples of evidence which are found in theories which are non-conspiratorial in nature, and that often the kinds of evidence that are put forward in support of non-conspiracy theories are taken to be unproblematic in a way that they are taken to be problematic in the conspiracy theorist case. What seems to motivate our skepticism of evidence about conspiracies is a skepticism about the existence of conspiracies. We assume they don't happen or are rare, and thus we introduce a high evidential threshold for conspiracy theories we do not apply to other theories, and thus we judge certain kinds of evidence as likely or suspicious because of it, even if the same kinds of evidence are being used to debunk said theories. Whilst we would like to be able to appeal to experts when it comes to assessing evidence, it is not clear that the kind of debunking of conspiracy theories by reference to experts thus far is going to be of much use to us. Maybe there are no conspiracy theory experts in the accredited or institutional sense, but the role of expertise in debunking conspiracy theories here seems to be overly prone to the worries that conspiracy theorists put forward, and it is not clear that these worries are prima facie unwarranted or unjustified. None of this tells us that we should embrace all conspiracy theories, but what it does tell us is that often our motivation for debunking conspiracy theories is based upon wanting to assess them as a kind before we assess them on the evidence. This, I contend, gets things back to front. We need to grapple with the evidence of conspiracy theories to show whether those theories are warranted or unwarranted. Dismissing conspiracy theories simply because they are called conspiracy theories gets things back to front. Finesse.